On a July morning in 2016, 45-year-old Nick Morales sped down a desert road in Marana, Arizona, just outside of Tucson. Nick saw the mountains in the distance as he drove past several large airplane hangars and a massive 7,000-foot runway. Then Nick slowed down, turned off the road near a white concrete office building, and pulled into the parking lot of Marana Aerospace Solutions. Marana Aerospace Solutions was a company that handled aircraft maintenance for major commercial airlines and aircraft manufacturers like Boeing and Airbus. And Nick was the company's director of maintenance, a job that came with a ton of responsibility and a whole bunch of people that worked underneath him. Nick stepped out of his car. He was tall with brown eyes, he had a short military-style haircut, and a goatee that was just starting to turn gray. He walked through the parking lot toward the office building, and it felt like most July mornings in that part of Arizona. It was already 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and Nick knew that even by midday, it would be at least 10 degrees hotter. But Nick didn't mind the heat. Before getting into the aerospace industry, he had been a decorated United States Marine and had served in Kuwait, a very hot place in the Middle East, during the First Gulf War. After that experience, working on airplanes in the Arizona desert felt comfortable by comparison. Nick stepped inside the building, and right away he felt the cold blast from the air conditioner. He said good morning to a few coworkers, and then he walked to his office, sat down, checked his email, and began going over his schedule for the day. Nick wanted to head outside to one of the airplane hangars so he could check on the progress of a particular job, but his office phone rang. And so Nick answered, and he heard the director of human resources on the other line. And the HR director asked if Nick wouldn't mind coming to his office so they could chat. Nick hung up, and he felt really annoyed. He didn't know what the director wanted, but he knew from experience that getting called into HR was rarely a good thing. Nick walked out and headed down a long hallway to the HR director's office. The door was already open, and the director waved Nick inside. Nick closed the door behind him and took a seat. The HR director was a nice guy, and he and Nick got along fine, but Nick really just wanted this meeting to end quickly, so he asked point blank, "What's going on?" And the HR director said, one of Nick's employees had recently filed a complaint against him. Now, Nick knew the HR director was not going to tell him who actually filed this complaint, but Nick wanted to know what the complaint actually was. And the director told him that the employee basically complained that Nick was way too hard on his team all the time. Nick shook his head. Complaints like that made no sense to him. If somebody was not doing their job the right way, Nick just told them. He wasn't trying to be mean, he was just trying to be efficient. A lot of his team members figured that Nick's straightforward and often harsh management style just stemmed from his military background. But that actually was not the reason. Nick knew working on aircrafts affected the lives and safety of other people, and so he saw no room for error. So if somebody did their job poorly, he had to make sure they knew about it. The HR director understood where Nick was coming from, and he wasn't planning on taking any immediate action against Nick or anything. He just wanted Nick to know what was going on. Nick left the office and walked outside into the hot Arizona sun. As he paced around for a second, he thought about the HR complaint more and more, and the more he thought about it, the more annoyed he got, because he was actually pretty sure he knew who made the complaint. James LePan, a safety inspector on Nick's team, had recently clashed with Nick at work. Nick had caught James parking in a restricted area, and he let him have it. Then Nick saw James spending time on his personal tablet during work hours, and again, he let him have it. While Nick felt like what he did was justified, he knew there was a pretty good chance James did not feel the same way. Eventually, Nick began walking towards an airplane hangar that was off in the distance. He could have driven over, but he figured, walking would help him clear his head. As he walked, Nick couldn't help but think about maybe confronting James about this whole complaint, but he knew, that would be a mistake. He didn't even know for sure if James really was the guy who made the complaint. And Nick knew he really could not afford to keep drawing the attention of HR. Nick had had run-ins with the HR department before, but those run-ins had nothing to do with his actual work. Nick had been described by many as a ladies' man, and he had lived up to that description during his time at Marana Aerospace. He had dated at least 3 women he had worked with, and there was a pretty good chance there were more women at work, but Nick wouldn't admit to them. And 2 of those 3 relationships that he admitted to ended really badly. Over a year earlier, Nick had been dating a colleague, a woman named Jessica, and she had started spending a lot of her time at Nick's house. But one evening, she had caught Nick in bed with another woman they worked with named Claudia. Jessica was furious and she lashed out at Nick, and Nick basically told her, okay, fine, the relationship's over and you need to leave. And so soon after that, Jessica left and Claudia began spending most of her time at Nick's place. But that relationship also fell apart when Nick started seeing yet another colleague named Christina. And when Nick and Christina had recently gotten engaged, it did not go over well with his ex-girlfriends. And so the whole thing had played out like a soap opera at work, and even though the company did not have a policy against office relationships, Nick's actions and his ex-girlfriend's anger had previously landed him in the HR director's office. Nick walked into the airplane hangar and saw members of his team hard at work. The sights and sounds of the hangar immediately put Nick at ease, and he pushed aside any thoughts about his personal affairs. Even employees who didn't necessarily love the way Nick managed them knew Nick took his job really seriously, and he worked harder than anyone. So Nick spent the rest of the day checking in on different maintenance projects and stepping in to help whenever his team needed him. By the time he was heading home that evening, the sun was starting to set, and it was painting the desert orange and pink. And something happened on the drive home, like it did most nights when Nick left work. He suddenly changed into this totally different person. The hard-nosed, confrontational boss suddenly became a soft-spoken guy who loved his dog and tending to plants in his garden. Nick drove down the street of his secluded suburban neighborhood and pulled into the garage of his 2-story house. He walked inside and heard his beloved pit bull terrier, Smokey, barking and running to greet him. Nick crouched down and pet Smokey and talked to the dog like he was a baby. Then he told Smokey it was time to go for a walk, and the dog got even more excited. Nick and Smokey headed outside just as the last rays of the sun disappeared for the night. After he and Smokey had been walking for a while, Nick felt his phone vibrate inside of his pocket. He grabbed it and looked at a text message and smiled. Then he told Smokey they needed to pick up the pace because Nick's fiancée, Christina, was heading over to the house and he couldn't wait to see her. On July 17, 2016, so about a week after Nick dealt with that HR complaint, he spent a lazy Sunday with his fiancée, Christina, at her house. Nick had been married twice, and after his second divorce, he had sworn to his friends and family that he would never get married again. But soon after Nick and Christina had met at work, Nick began to change his mind. He thought Christina was beautiful and that she was one of the most positive, considerate people he had ever met. Christina knew about Nick's past with other women at work, but after spending time with him, she stopped worrying about it. She loved Nick and wanted to be with him. So when Nick had asked her to marry him, she immediately said yes. And so that Sunday, Nick and Christina laid around Christina's house and discussed potential wedding venues and other wedding details. But then Nick brought up the recent HR complaint. For some reason, even a week later now, it was still bothering him. Christina knew Nick well enough that she knew he was not about to change his management style. She just wished his employees could see that Nick actually was very different than the persona they saw at work. At home, he was a funny, caring, loving guy. It was just the way he had to be at work. That's why he acted that way. Ultimately, Christina told Nick, "Don't worry about it. It'll be fine. It's just work stuff. It'll go away. Don't stress." The couple chatted for a bit longer. Then around 6 p.m., Nick got up and he gave Christina a kiss, and then he headed back to his house. Christina had some things to deal with at her own place, so she was going to stay there for the night. Once Nick got home, he took Smokey out for a walk and then relaxed and watched some TV. Later that night, he called Christina and they talked some more. On nights they didn't stay together, they always made sure to talk on the phone before bed, and then they would always text each other first thing in the morning. Nick told Christina he loved her and then said goodnight. He went upstairs to his bedroom and Smokey followed. Nick took off all his clothes, he often slept naked when it was this hot out, and he climbed into bed. Smokey leapt up onto the bed too and curled up by Nick's feet, and pretty soon they were both fast asleep. But several hours later, at around 4 a.m., so the next morning, Smokey suddenly woke up when he heard a sound coming from outside the window on the roof. A few hours later, at around 8:30 a.m., Christina listened to Nick's voicemail for the third or fourth time, and she had no idea what was going on. Nick woke up early every day, and he usually headed out to work by 6 a.m. So when Christina didn't stay with Nick, she always woke up to a good morning text from him. But Nick did not text her that morning, and he wasn't answering his phone. And when she had called into work, someone in Nick's department said he hadn't shown up yet. Nick never overslept, So Christina worried that maybe he had gotten sick the night before and wasn't feeling well enough to get out of bed. Christina hung up her phone, slipped it in her purse, and walked out to her car. She drove right over to Nick's house. A few minutes after 9 a.m., Christina parked her car right out front of Nick's, and as soon as she got out, she instantly knew something was wrong. She could hear Smokey barking loudly from the backyard. Smokey always slept in the bed, and that included the nights when Christina stayed over. And even if Nick had let Smokey outside that morning, he would never have left the dog by himself barking like that. Christina rushed up to the front door and used the house key Nick had given her to open up the door. She walked inside, and what she saw totally confused her. There were all these cleaning products just laying out on the living room floor, like someone had just literally dropped them and then run away. She called out to Nick, but got no response. So she walked upstairs and headed down the hallway towards his bedroom. When she got to the bedroom, she found the door was cracked open. From the hallway, Christina again yelled for Nick, but again, there was no answer. So, after taking a deep breath, Christina pushed the bedroom door open and walked inside. And immediately, she began crying and shaking her head. Nick was laying still on his bed, totally naked and covered in blood. Christina grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Her voice cracked, and she couldn't hold back the tears. She told the dispatcher she believed her fiancé had been shot. Later that morning, Detective Jennifer Garcia of the Pima County Sheriff's Department parked her car a few houses down from Nick's. She could see the crime scene tape that was stretched across Nick's property, and she saw a couple of officers standing with a woman who was hunched over, crying and petting a pit bull. Detective Garcia had butterflies in her stomach. She'd only been a homicide detective for 7 months, and this was the first case she was actually taking the lead on. But Garcia had been preparing for this moment since she was a little girl, really since the first time she saw her grandfather in his police uniform. She had known, even back then, that she also wanted to be a cop when she grew up. And it just so happened that Garcia grew up to be really smart, and she had a keen eye for evidence. So, at a relatively young age, she had already proven to be a very skilled detective. But Garcia knew leading an investigation was a different thing altogether. Still, she believed she was ready. So she took a deep breath, stepped out of her car, and began walking towards Nick's house. Detective Garcia spoke briefly with a few of the officers who had first arrived at the scene. They told her the woman who had found the body, Christina, had identified the victim as her fiancé, Nick Morales. Christina had told the officers about where Nick worked and what his job was, and she also told them that he was a former United States Marine. Garcia thanked the officers, then put on her gloves and headed inside the house. Then she, along with several forensics analysts, started to make their way through the house. And a few things immediately stood out to Garcia. She saw the cleaning products on the living room floor, then she found that the cabinet under the kitchen sink where the cleaning products had most likely been stored was left open. Now, she hadn't even seen the victim yet, but it looked to her like somebody had tried to clean up evidence they left behind, but had abandoned the job. Garcia headed upstairs and into the bedroom, and she saw a ballistics expert cataloging evidence. The ballistics expert told Garcia he had found multiple bullet casings from a .45 caliber handgun. And these casings had a distinct manufacturer's mark on them. There were 5 stars on the head of the casing. Then Garcia walked over to the bed and got a good look at Nick's body. Blood spatter covered the sheets and parts of the wall behind him. But Garcia also noticed some spots of blood that were all over the carpet by the window. And she noticed there was a big square of the carpet that had been cut out, like someone had removed a portion of the carpet. She also noticed a small pile of shattered glass, and so it looked like the window had been broken and then opened. Garcia was pretty sure the window is where the killer had entered the house, but since Nick's bedroom was up on the second floor and not the first floor, she needed to figure out how the killer would have gotten access to the second floor window. Garcia stepped away from the window and walked into the bathroom that connected to the bedroom. She saw more blood spots on the floor, but that really was not the thing that caught her attention. The thing that caught her attention was the bathroom floor had the distinct smell of mouthwash all over it. Garcia thought that was really weird, and she wondered if maybe it was somehow connected to all the cleaning products downstairs, like somebody had tried to disinfect the bathroom floor using this mouthwash. Garcia let the ballistics and forensics team continue their work inside, and she headed downstairs and out to the backyard. And once she was in the backyard, she turned and looked up, and she could see Nick's bedroom window up on the second floor, and she could also see there was a ladder lying on the ground right below it. And so Garcia walked over and picked the ladder up and placed it up against the side of the house. And with this ladder, she was able to climb up and actually get on this small roof that basically sat at the first floor level and kind of wrapped around the small backyard patio, almost like an awning. And she could stand on that awning and actually could see directly in to Nick's bedroom. And there was actually enough space on this little roof that if you wanted to, you could walk over and actually climb into Nick's bedroom window. Garcia climbed back down the ladder, and she already had a pretty good idea about how Nick's killer actually carried out their attack. Not long after Garcia had gotten down from the roof, an officer walked into the backyard and told her that the forensics team had just found something in the garage that she needed to see. So Garcia walked back through the house and then into the garage, and there she found a forensics analyst who was crouched over a bucket. And so she joined him, and she noticed the bucket was filled with water. The analyst pointed to several small threads that were floating in this water, and the analyst told Garcia that these were carpet fibers, and he was almost positive they matched the fibers from the carpet inside the house. And so this discovery helped Garcia make sense of all the cleaning products in the living room and also what she'd seen upstairs. Garcia thought the killer had probably spilled their own blood and tried to clean the carpet and even cut out a piece of it to get rid of that evidence, but they had failed. So Garcia hoped the forensics team would find enough DNA samples to point her right to the murderer. After completing their first sweep of the house, Detective Garcia and members of her team met with Nick's fiancée, Christina, and a few of the neighbors. Garcia got a little more information about Nick's job from Christina, and Christina made it clear that some of the people who worked for Nick were not that fond of him. So Garcia told one of her team members to call Marana Aerospace to see if anybody in particular had a serious grudge against Nick. Then, when Garcia and other investigators spoke to the neighbors, they would say they had not heard anything out of the ordinary the night before or early that morning. That seemed totally weird to Garcia. The houses on Nick's block were pretty close together, and multiple gunshots had to have been fired. I mean, Nick's body was riddled with bullet holes, and based on the broken window and the view of Nick's bed from the roof, Garcia believed at least one of those shots had been fired from outside on the roof into Nick's bedroom. So how did no neighbor hear a gunshot? Garcia knew there was a potential obvious answer to this question. The killer could have been using a suppressor, or a silencer as many people call it, on his gun, which would have limited the sound coming out of the gun when it was fired, basically making it silent. And this immediately gave Garcia another idea. Some new handgun users find it much more difficult to fire accurately when using a suppressor because the suppressor adds weight and length to the barrel of the gun, and it can affect your aim. And this can be an even bigger issue when you're talking about making a long-distance shot. It's just really hard to do it with a suppressor unless you're experienced. So Detective Garcia thought there was a good chance that their shooter was someone who had real firearms training in their background. Garcia went back inside to walk through the house again when she got a call from Marana Aerospace's Human Resources Director. He had heard about what happened to Nick, and he had heard that police had reached out to his company to see if anybody had it out for Nick. And he would tell Garcia that another employee at the company, James Lapon, had recently filed a complaint against Nick. And the HR director had also noticed something strange. James had shown up to work that day wearing a bandage on his arm. Detective Garcia knew the killer had left a trail of blood throughout Nick's room, and maybe that blood was coming from a cut on their arm they got when they climbed in through that broken window. So, after talking to the HR director, Garcia quickly made her way to Marana Aerospace to speak with James and see what was going on with him and Nick. When she got there, an employee led Garcia to one of the airplane hangars where James was working, and right away Garcia noticed that James still had the bandage on his arm. Garcia walked over, introduced herself, and told him that she needed to ask him a few questions, and James said he was happy to answer them. James was 35 years old with brown hair and brown eyes, and he towered over Garcia. He was at least 6'3" tall, and he was very physically imposing. But Garcia didn't let that affect her. She asked him why he had filed an HR complaint against Nick, and James, he shook his head and he said he hadn't wanted this to turn into such a big deal. He just felt like Nick had crossed the line a couple of times as a manager with just the way he was treating people, and since Nick was not the easiest guy to talk to, James had gone directly to HR. Garcia nodded and then asked James about the bandage on his arm. James would say he got a pretty bad cut on his arm about a week earlier on the job, and he said there were guys he was working with that could vouch for him, and he said he had reopened the cut while doing some work on his house this past weekend, hence the bandage. Garcia said she would check in with his coworkers. Then she told James she had a few more questions. Did he have firearms training? And where had he been the day before and early that morning? James didn't hide anything. He said he did own several guns and he enjoyed going to the gun range and going hunting, and so he did take serious firearms training just so he could be a safe, responsible gun owner. This all made sense to Garcia. Hunting and shooting were very common pastimes in this area. Then James told Garcia that he was at home all day Sunday with his wife and kids. He and his wife had gone to bed together that night, and then he woke up Monday morning and went right to work. Then James peered down at Garcia, and he told her, look, I never liked Nick. I'm not going to pretend I like Nick, but I would never have done anything to hurt the guy. Garcia thanked James for taking the time to talk to her, and then she walked out of the hangar. And it wouldn't take her long to walk around the company and find several people who had witnessed James get hurt on the job. So that could possibly explain the bandage on his arm. But after making the rounds at Marana Aerospace, Garcia quickly realized that a disgruntled employee like James might not be the most likely suspect, because she heard that Nick had made at least a couple of women he worked with really, really mad. And this had to do with romantic relationships, which historically absolutely lead to murder and conflict and violence. So Garcia headed back to the sheriff's station to set up a series of interviews. That evening, Garcia met with James's wife. She was an Army vet who prided herself on being straightforward, and she told Garcia basically the same story her husband had, that they had spent Sunday with their kids and then they had gone to bed. And she would tell Garcia that, she knew her husband had not been a fan of Nick, but from her perspective, it just seemed like this was the usual way people got fed up with their bosses. It was nothing more than that. Detective Garcia thanked her for coming in. It was too early to cross anyone off the list of potential suspects, but James's wife had not given Garcia any reason to doubt that she was telling the truth. So now, Garcia turned her focus from Nick's work life to his romantic life. On July 19th, a day after Nick's body was discovered, Garcia sat across the table inside of a cramped interrogation room from one of Nick's ex-girlfriends, Claudia Banks. Claudia got really animated when she spoke, and she seemed very ready and willing to talk a lot. But what Claudia had to say was really not what Garcia had expected. Garcia assumed she was in for an angry rant over a jilted lover. But instead, Claudia told the detective that Nick had been really awesome. She said he was a great listener and a lot of fun to hang out with. Garcia sat there for a second feeling stunned. From what she'd heard back at Marana Aerospace, Nick's exes had been really mad at him, and some had even complained to HR about him. Claudia said she did not fit that description at all. She said she was totally happy for Nick when he got engaged, and now she was devastated that he was gone. Then Claudia got a very angry, serious look on her face, and she told Garcia there were two people police really needed to speak to: Nick's other ex-girlfriend, Jessica Stillwell, and her own ex-boyfriend, Justin Skinner. Garcia leaned forward in her chair. She had not heard Justin's name before. But Claudia said that, when she and Nick were together, their relationship had actually come after they had broken two other people's hearts. Remember, Nick had kicked Jessica out of his house after she caught him cheating on her, and Claudia was pretty sure Jessica had never forgiven Nick for that. And Claudia dumped her boyfriend at the time, Justin, to be with Nick. But according to Claudia, this was not even the most significant part of this story. Claudia said on Sunday, the night before Nick's body was found, she had been hanging out with her mother at a bar when out of nowhere, her old ex, Justin, walked in. Claudia said she had done her best to avoid Justin after they had broken up because he had gone full-blown stalker mode, hanging out outside of her work, following Nick in his car, and stuff like that. And at the bar that Sunday, Justin had tried to talk to Claudia, but she wasn't having it, so she and her mother left. But then, just that morning, only a day after somebody murdered Nick, Claudia found a note on her front door. And the note was from Justin saying how sorry he was about Nick's death and that if Claudia needed someone to talk to, he was there for her. Detective Garcia stared across the table at Claudia. This story sounded too on the nose to be real. The stalker ex-boyfriend who hated Nick for, stealing his girl just happened to show up where she was the night before the murder, and then he had a note for her the day after Nick turned up dead? Garcia thanked Claudia and told her she could go now. The detective still wanted to talk to Nick's other ex-girlfriend, Jessica, but now it seemed like Justin was the highest on her suspect list. The following day, Detective Garcia drove to Justin's house to meet with him. The temperature had hit 105 degrees Fahrenheit, and Garcia could feel herself starting to sweat just during the short walk from her car to his front door. She knocked on the door, and Justin let her inside. Garcia followed him into the kitchen, subtly looking around his house while she walked. Nothing really stood out about the house. It looked like a lot of the places she had seen that belonged to other single guys, a little cluttered and not much decoration. But something about Justin caught Garcia's attention right away. He had several long scratches on both of his arms. Garcia sat down with Justin at the kitchen table, and she got right to the point. She asked him if he still blamed Nick for breaking up his relationship with Claudia. Justin said he was not mad anymore about Nick and Claudia, and that he had let it all go, but when he was telling Garcia this, he didn't look up at her, he didn't make eye contact. And so she was pretty sure he didn't fully mean what he was saying, that maybe he was still mad. So Garcia said in response, if he had let things go, why had he shown up at the bar where Claudia had been on Sunday night, and why did he leave her a note just a day after Nick had been found dead? Justin's voice got real quiet, and he almost immediately began to backtrack what he had just said. He told Garcia that actually he did want to get back together with Claudia. He missed her. But he made it very clear he had nothing to do with Nick's murder. Garcia stayed on him and asked him about the cuts on his arms. Justin looked down at his arms and he kind of laughed, and he said he was a landscaper, so he always had little cuts all over his arms and hands. It was just part of his work. He didn't even think about them anymore. Garcia looked across the table at Justin. She couldn't quite get a read on him. Was he a broken-hearted guy who was just awkward and overbearing in trying to get his girlfriend back? Or was he jealous and angry enough to go kill a man to try to get his girlfriend back? So Garcia asked Justin if he would provide police with a DNA sample. She said it would be quick and easy, she would just swab his cheek. But Justin shook his head and said, no, I don't want to do that. Garcia smiled and told him she totally understood. Something like this could feel very invasive. Then Garcia stood up, and for a second, it must have seemed to Justin like she was about to leave. But she stopped and turned around and leaned in towards Justin, and with a smile on her face, she told him the best way to clear his name and to make sure everybody knew he did have nothing to do with Nick's death was to provide a DNA sample right here, right now. Justin looked up at Garcia, and with a very determined look on his face like he was about to do something big, he told Garcia, okay, I will provide a DNA sample. A little while later, Garcia headed back to the station with Justin's DNA sample for testing. The results would take some time to get back, so she prepared to interview another potential suspect, Nick's other ex-girlfriend, Jessica Stillwell. Later that day, Garcia met with Jessica in the same interview room where she'd met with Nick's other ex-girlfriend, Claudia. But from the moment Jessica sat down, Garcia could tell this interview was going to be very different from her interview with Claudia. Jessica looked angry, and unlike Claudia, she did not think Nick had been really awesome. She said Nick had cheated on her in full view of her, and then totally broken her heart by basically kicking her out of the house and not caring at all about her. But she said that was not the only reason she had been so upset. Jessica also had a daughter, and when things fell apart with Nick, her daughter had been spending a ton of time at his house too, and so she was really sad. She missed Nick, and so the whole thing had just screwed up this little girl's life. Garcia listened and nodded along as Jessica spoke, like she was a friend who Jessica could confide in. And as she did this, it struck Garcia that if Jessica was involved in Nick's murder, she really was not trying to hide it. This was a woman who obviously carried a very serious grudge against Nick. Finally, after several minutes of ranting and raving, Jessica stopped talking. So Garcia asked her where she'd been on Sunday and then Monday morning, the time period when Nick was killed. Jessica said that she and her daughter had stayed at her mother's house the entire weekend, and then she woke up and drove to work from there on Monday. Garcia asked if Jessica would mind handing over her phone for a little while before she left. Garcia explained that police could download information and text messages from her phone, and that would be the easiest way for them to confirm Jessica's alibi. They would be able to tell if she really had been at her mother's house. Jessica had no hesitation. She reached into her pocket and put her phone on the table and told Garcia the police could do whatever they needed. She was telling the truth, and so she had nothing to hide. Garcia thanked her and then left the room with the phone. And at this point, police conducted a forensics download on the phone that would provide them with cell phone location data. But it would also give investigators a look at who Jessica had been texting with and what she had been saying in those messages. On July 21st, 2016, so 3 days after Nick's body had been found, Detective Garcia sat working at her desk. She had a handful of legitimate suspects, and she was still waiting on 2 pieces of evidence that could potentially break the case wide open: Justin's DNA results and a complete view of all Jessica's text messages. In the meantime, Garcia went back over her interviews from Nick's work to see if she had overlooked anything. Then Garcia's phone rang, and it was Nick's brother on the other line. Garcia had spoken to him once before, soon after Nick's death, but he said this call had nothing to do with that first interview. Nick's brother said he had just talked to one of Nick's friends, and this friend was pretty sure he had important information about this case. Garcia took down the friend's details, thanked Nick's brother, and then called Nick's friend. The guy was at work, so Garcia told him not to go anywhere. She would head right over. Not long after the call, Garcia made her way through Tucson and arrived at a metal fabrication shop that Nick's friend managed. Garcia went inside. The place was loud, and several men were wearing these huge welder's helmets and were hard at work on different projects, but Garcia found Nick's friend waiting for her already at the front desk. He told Garcia that after the initial shock and grief of Nick's death had subsided a bit, he started thinking about anybody who might have wanted to hurt his friend. And then he remembered something he thought could be big. Months earlier, somebody who knew Nick well had come into the shop asking for a few specific pieces of equipment. Nick's friend said that even at the time, he thought the order was a little strange, because he could really only think of one thing those pieces of equipment could be used for. Garcia asked him what he meant, and Nick's friend said, well, the equipment could be used to repair a firearm suppressor or silencer. Garcia's face lit up. She asked Nick's friend, please tell me you have a record of that purchase. And he said he did, and he had actually already pulled the information for her. Nick's friend handed Garcia the receipt with the list of items and the buyer's information. And when Garcia saw the buyer's name, she immediately felt a rush. She thanked Nick's friend and hustled out to her car. Garcia had spent only a week on her first case as a lead homicide detective, and already she was sure she had just solved the crime. Based on that receipt from the metal fabrication shop, multiple interviews, and evidence collected throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Nick in the early morning hours of July 18, 2016. At around 4 a.m. that morning, the killer parked their car a few houses down from Nick's. They knew the neighborhood would be dark and quiet that time of morning. They also knew the perfect place to stage their attack. The killer got out of their car and walked quickly down the street towards Nick's house. They wore all black clothes and a pair of gloves. On one hip, the killer had a .45 caliber handgun with a suppressor attached, and on the other hip was a folded pocket knife inside of a leather sheath. The killer avoided the glow of a few streetlights and then walked around Nick's house to the backyard. The killer hopped the low fence and scanned the yard. They saw a ladder leaned up against the wall where they knew Nick kept it. The killer moved across the yard quickly and quietly. They grabbed the ladder and placed it against the house near the back porch and climbed up onto that kind of small roof, that awning where you could easily see into Nick's bedroom. And so once up on that roof, the killer got in position kind of right outside of Nick's window. They knelt down, and from their spot, they could clearly see Nick in his bed. And so the killer took the gun off their hip, they took a slow breath, they raised their gun, and they fired. The glass in the window shattered, and the bullet struck Nick as he lay in bed. But the gun, because of the silencer, made virtually no noise, and so nobody in the neighborhood heard any of this happening. But the killer didn't waste any time. They took a few steps forward and reached through the now shattered window. They unlocked the window, opened it up, and began to climb through it. The killer heard the sound of a dog barking inside the room, and they felt a piece of broken glass cut into their arm as they climbed through. The pain stung, but they couldn't worry about that now. The killer landed on Nick's bedroom floor, and they saw glass from the window all around them. Nick's dog barked and ran around the room, but it did not attack the killer. The killer looked over at Nick, who was lying in bed, and the killer could see Nick was not moving. But the killer didn't want to take any chances, and so as they walked across the room towards Nick's bed, the killer raised their silenced pistol and fired multiple shots into Nick's body. And then finally, when the killer was standing right over Nick, they aimed their gun right at Nick's forehead and shot him one more time, execution style. And so at this point, there was no question Nick was deceased. But the killer felt that sting from the cut on their arm, and they glanced back to see there was a trail of blood dripping behind them. And so the killer started to panic, and the dog kept on barking, which really stressed the killer out. And so the killers slipped their silenced pistol back into their waistband, and then looked around the dark room, and then headed towards the bathroom door. They stepped inside the bathroom, turned on the light, and then stuck their arm under the sink and began to wash off their cut. But when the killer turned to leave, they saw there was blood still on the bathroom floor from their cut. So, kind of impulsively, the killer grabbed a bottle of mouthwash from the counter and just poured it all over the floor and rubbed their shirt sleeves all over it, attempting to clean up the blood with it. But it was not working, and the dog just kept on barking over and over and over again. So the killer just rushed back into the bedroom, grabbed the dog by the collar, and ran downstairs and put it out in the backyard. The killer closed the back door, turned, and headed back towards the kitchen. There, they opened up the cabinet under the sink and grabbed cleaning products, a hand towel, and a bucket. They filled the bucket with water and carried all their supplies upstairs to the bedroom. Once there, they turned on the light, and they saw there was all this blood spatter on the carpet. Now, the killer knew a lot of that blood was Nick's, but for sure, some of it had to be the killer's blood. So they got down on their hands and knees and sprayed one of the cleaning products on the floor, dipped the towel in the bucket of water, and started scrubbing. And each time they dipped the towel in the bucket, they would leave carpet fibers behind in the water. But no matter how hard they scrubbed, the blood just was not coming out of this carpet, and it was taking way too much time trying to clean it. So they dropped the cleaning supplies, they took out their pocket knife off their hip, and they cut this big bloody piece of carpet away and carried it and the cleaning supplies out of the room, and they headed downstairs. But by this point, the killer was well aware that things had really not gone to plan, and at this point, the killer just wanted to get the heck out of the house. So they just dropped the cleaning products on the living room floor, but they held on to that towel they were using to scrub the carpet, as well as the actual chunk of carpet they cut away. Then the killer also hid the bucket of water in the garage, hoping nobody would find it. Then the killer ran back upstairs, went into Nick's bedroom, they climbed back out the window onto that roof, then he climbed down the ladder and then lowered the ladder onto the ground so it didn't look as obvious that he had used it to climb to the second floor, and then he climbed over the exterior fence around the property, leaving behind Smokey the dog in the backyard, and the killer just ran the rest of the way back to their car. The killer would then speed home, change out of their clothes, and put a big old bandage on their arm, and then drive into work at Marana Aerospace Solutions. James Lapon, the man who had filed that HR complaint, had murdered Nick. But James's reasoning behind the murder went much deeper than just some run-ins the two men had at work. It would turn out James was having an affair with Jessica, one of Nick's ex-girlfriends. And apparently, Jessica still talked all the time about Nick, and it totally drove James crazy, so he killed Nick. Garcia had first discovered this relationship between James and Jessica when Jessica had handed over her phone. They had seen the text messages between them. And soon after that, James had actually admitted to the affair as well. But he still at the time said he had nothing to do with Nick's murder. But investigators dove deeper into Jessica's text messages, and they found several exchanges between her and James that seemed really strange. In one of those messages, James implied he was going to, quote, handle his problems with Nick. In another, James asked what kind of dog Nick had, and Jessica told him it was a pit bull. Then, investigators found maybe the strangest message on Jessica's phone, Nick telling her to delete all of their text conversations. Soon after receiving those text messages, Detective Garcia received the DNA test results of her other major suspect, Justin Skinner. And Justin's samples did not match samples found at the murder scene. So Garcia definitely saw James as her primary suspect. After all, he even had this mysterious cut on his arm. Then Nick's friend at the metal fabrication shop had handed over the receipt from the customer who had bought equipment to potentially repair a firearms suppressor, and Detective Garcia saw James's name on that receipt. And so at that point, she was certain he was the murderer. Garcia got a warrant to search James's house, and when investigators did the search, they would find boxes of bullets inside of his house that had the same unique marking as the bullet casings found at the murder scene, the 5 stars on the casing head. And so at that point, police would arrest James for Nick's murder. Some investigators thought that Jessica could have been involved in her ex-boyfriend's murder, but she was ultimately never charged with anything connected to the crime. At James's trial, one of the most important testimonies came from his own wife. During the investigation, she had corroborated James's alibi. But when James was in prison awaiting trial, his wife had watched this movie in which an abused wife stands up to her abusive husband. And apparently when she saw this, it really spoke to her, and so it made her decide she had to tell the truth. James's wife admitted that she had lied to police. She said James was violent and abusive, and she was scared he would hurt her and her kids if she didn't do what he said. She told the jury she knew James had murdered Nick, and when he came home from killing Nick, he had told her exactly what to say to police. In the end, the jury found James guilty of first-degree murder, and James was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
In the 1850s and 1860s, Edwin Booth was the man. He was this extremely famous American actor who basically anywhere he went in America, people would know who he was. He was extremely recognizable, a household name, an A-list celebrity through and through. But his acting prowess and his career and his fame, those are not the things we remember him for. In early 1865, when Edwin was 31 years old and was at the height of his acting fame, he walked into a New Jersey train station and walked through the building to the actual platform where the trains are. And as soon as he turned a corner and actually saw the train that he wanted to board, he very quickly realized that he probably was not going to get on that train. There was already this huge throng of people out on the platform pressed up against the side of this train, and they're all waving their arms around and yelling. And in the middle of this big group of people with his back pressed up against the train was the train's conductor, whose job was to sell tickets in addition to driving the train. But from Edwin's perspective, it seemed fairly obvious based on the conductor's body language and what some of the people in the crowd were yelling that there just weren't enough tickets. That's why this big unruly group had formed, because all these people were rushing forward trying to buy one of the last few tickets. Now, Edwin could have very easily just walked up and announced himself and shown his very famous face, and almost certainly he would have gotten a ticket. But to this point, Edwin had not been recognized in this train station, and so he wanted to keep a low profile, and so he decided against that idea. Instead, he decided he would just kind of join this big group and, try to flag down the conductor and try to buy one of these tickets, and if he didn't, so be it. And so Edwin, instead of going to the back of this group, he went around to the right side, close up against the side of the train, and right as he got to the outside of the group and he turned in towards the group, he looked up at where the conductor was, and he saw the conductor turning around and walking back into the train. He'd clearly sold all of his tickets, and so anyone who had not purchased one yet, like Edwin, they were out of luck. They'd have to wait for the next train. Edwin was about to just walk away and wait for the next train when he noticed the crowd in front of him. They didn't disperse like he was doing. Instead, they all seemed to kind of surge forward towards the train, which was now moving. And as they pushed forward as if they were going to jump onto this train, even though they didn't have tickets, one man who was towards the front of this group, right up against the train, he falls to the ground and gets trapped halfway under the train. His lower half was literally on the tracks under the train, and his upper half is now under this big crowd of people that are now trampling him. And so Edwin can see very clearly that if someone does not grab this guy and pull him out soon, he's gonna get run over by the train. And so Edwin, without any hesitation, he jumps forward onto the ground on the platform, and he reaches his hand out through the feet of all these people in this crowd, and he grabs the collar of the guy who had fallen, and he pulls him. And as he's pulling him, this guy who's on his back, he starts pushing with his legs and his feet. And within about a fraction of a second, they yank him out from under the train, and the guy who had fallen and Edwin are lying on their backs on the platform. And before they could even talk to each other, they sat up and watched as a big train wheel rolled over that piece of track where this guy had just been laying. Edwin had saved his life. The guy he had saved was a 21-year-old named Robert, and so the two of them, they stand up and they face each other for the first time, and when Robert sees Edwin, he gasps, because this is Edwin Booth, the mega celebrity. He could not believe that was the guy who had just saved him. And while Robert was very thankful, he also was just totally dumbfounded at the absurdity of the situation he was in. And so eventually Edwin just says, hey, I'm glad I was here to help you. No big deal. Next time be more careful. And then at some point the men just shook hands and parted ways. Edwin would eventually get on the next train and he would go wherever it was he needed to go. And before long, his very busy schedule kind of occupied his mind and he had kind of forgotten about what happened on the train platform. But a few days later, Edwin got a letter in the mail from a very high-ranking government official thanking him for saving Robert's life, because it would turn out Robert Lincoln was the eldest son of the then President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Now, to be clear, Edwin was extremely famous and had lots and lots of influence and knew lots of very important people, but he had never had any interaction with anyone in the Lincoln family before he met Robert on the train platform. So it was just a crazy coincidence that this mega celebrity happened to save the life of the president's son. But this coincidence was nothing compared to the coincidence that occurred next. On the evening of April 14th, 1865, so roughly 3 months after Edwin saved Robert, Robert's father, President Lincoln, sat down in a private seating area to watch a play at a Washington, D.C. theater. During the production at around 10:15 p.m., a man snuck into the private seating area and shot the president to death. The killer was Edwin's younger brother, John Wilkes Booth. This assassination had nothing to do with Edwin or his interaction with Robert on the train platform. This was an assassination that was formulated and carried out completely independently, meaning it was purely coincidence that just a few months after Edwin saved a Lincoln's life, his own brother took a Lincoln's life.
Our next story is called The Lamp. In 2004, Mitch was in his final semester at a college in Louisiana when he met another senior, a wonderful young lady named Kayla. From the instant he saw her, he knew he was in love. She played hard to get at first, but after several months, he won her over. After graduation, the pair stayed in Louisiana and moved in together while they got their careers off the ground. 2 years later, the pair got married, and almost immediately, Kayla got pregnant. At the time, Mitch's career was really starting to take off, which allowed Kayla to stay at home and take some time off. By the time their daughter was born, Mitch was making so much money that Kayla decided to just stay home and be a full-time mom. A couple years later, Kayla got pregnant again, and by the time their daughter was 2 years old, they had their son. Mitch adored his children. Every morning before he went to work, he would sneak into their room and he would watch them sleep. And then in the evenings, they would have these big family sit-down meals and then play games together until bedtime. Mitch's life was perfect. Shortly after his son's birth, Mitch was lounging on the couch in his TV room when he noticed out of the corner of his eye the red lamp in the corner of the room. It just looked funny. It was almost like the light itself was blurry, but when he looked a little bit closer at it, the entire lamp looked blurry. And so Mitch looked around the room and nothing else was blurry. He rubbed his eyes and looked back over at this lamp and it was still blurry. He turned the TV off and walked over to the lamp, and even though he was right in front of it, the lamp was still blurry. And Mitch didn't have bad eyesight, and so he's thinking, is there something wrong with me? Am I having a stroke? Do I have an aneurysm? Is there some sort of illness here that's making me see this lamp blurry when it's really not? But Mitch told himself he was healthy and that whatever this was, it was an anomaly and nothing to worry about. And so he went back over to the couch, turned the TV back on, and tried to ignore the lamp. But as he was watching TV, out of his peripheral vision, he couldn't help but notice this weird blurry lamp. And so finally, he turned the TV off again, and he turned to look at this lamp. And now, in addition to being blurry, it appeared to be upside down. Now Mitch was genuinely concerned that there was something wrong with him because, again, nothing else in the entire room was blurry or upside down. It was just this lamp. And so a few minutes later, his wife and his kids came home, and Mitch decided he would not tell them about this lamp. He didn't want to alarm them. He figures he will get to the bottom of this blurry lamp, and then he will tell his wife and kids. And so that night, the family has a sit-down meal, and then afterwards they play some games together, and then everybody goes upstairs and goes to sleep. But after everyone had gone to sleep, Mitch was just laying in bed thinking about this lamp. And so finally, he snuck out of his bed and went downstairs to the TV room, and he sat on the couch, and he just stared at this lamp. And for hours and hours, he just fixated himself on this lamp, watching it kind of morph around and turn upside down and get blurrier and blurrier by the second. The next day, Kayla found Mitch lying on the couch, passed out, and she asked him if he was okay. And again, Mitch didn't tell her about this lamp that was still blurry. He just told her that he wasn't feeling well and he was not going to go to work that day. But Mitch didn't go to work for 3 more days. He just sat on the couch and stared at this lamp. And Kayla obviously picked up on this strange behavior and kept poking and prodding to get more information about what was going on, but Mitch never told her the truth about this lamp. He just kept telling her he felt sick. She urged him to go see a doctor, but Mitch told her it would be fine, he'd get better. And then over time, as this lamp continued to morph and get bigger and get stranger and stranger, Mitch suddenly was unable to respond to his wife. He became totally unresponsive. And so obviously his wife became desperate and called the doctor. And as she's on the phone with the doctor trying to get advice about what to do, Mitch realizes the lamp is now growing in leaps and bounds. And before long, the lamp is the entire size of the room, and all he can see is the red color of this lamp. And then Mitch starts to hear these voices, these screams coming from somewhere in the distance. And then he feels this blinding pain in his head. And then he opens his eyes. And he looks up and he sees he's laying on the sidewalk next to one of the buildings at his college in Louisiana. And surrounding him is this crowd of people with wide eyes that are staring at him. Mitch had no idea what was going on, and so he naturally just began scanning the crowd, looking for Kayla and his kids to try to figure out, how he got here. But before he could ask any questions and before he could find his wife and kids, a police officer ran through the crowd, picked him up and ran him over to his police car, put him in the back, and then began driving away. And so while Mitch is in the back of this police car, he turns to the officer and he says, "What's going on?" And the officer would tell him he was attacked by a huge college football player. He got hit in the head and he fell backwards and he hit his head again and he fell unconscious. Mitch asked the officer where his wife and kids were, and the cop said he had no idea. And that's when it clicked for Mitch. The lamp wasn't real. Neither was his wife, neither was his daughter, neither was his son, neither was his life. For the past 10 years, it was all a hallucination while he was unconscious after getting attacked. Mitch was brought to the hospital where he would make a full physical recovery, but after being released, he was horribly depressed, and he had to get intense therapy to basically grieve for the loss of his family that never existed. These days, Mitch says he can barely remember what his family even looked like, but periodically in his dreams, he will catch a glimpse of his son in his peripheral vision, and his son is perpetually 5 years old, and he's trying to talk to his father, but Mitch can never understand what he says.
The next and final story of today's episode is called What's He Hiding?
In 2017, Daniel Beckwith was a 27-year-old genius hacker and prolific Bitcoin day trader. He was living in his modest childhood home in Bethesda, Maryland, with a multi-million-dollar fortune to his name. And he was hiding something major in his basement that when it was discovered by authorities, he would be convicted of one of the rarest criminal charges in the American legal justice system. But to understand this story, we have to go back to the beginning. Daniel was born in 1991 to his eccentric and brilliant parents, Linda and David. He would be their only child. David was a PhD and an accomplished opera singer that had trained under a famous French composer, and he had also performed at the White House. Linda was a Columbia Law School trained lawyer who at one time had been a government attorney, but she gave it up because she described it as a scummy profession, and she became a vocalist like her husband. When Daniel was just a toddler, he learned how to read, so it was clear he had unusually high intellect, which Linda guarded fiercely. She decided that public schools were not capable of teaching her son, and so she decided she would homeschool him. By the time Daniel was just 5 years old, he was consuming entire novels, and shortly after that, he was able to break down and reprogram his PlayStation. But despite his incredible intelligence, Daniel had a really lonely childhood. He He was rarely allowed to go outside and play with other kids, and on the rare chance that he was, his parents always hovered around him the entire time. And few playmates, or adults for that matter, ever came inside of Daniel's house because Daniel's parents were big-time hoarders. You couldn't take 2 steps into that house before knocking into a big stack of papers or books or old food containers. In 2000, when Daniel was 9 years old, his father was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, which left Linda, his mother, to take care of both of them. And in that time, Linda became obsessed with protecting their property. And so anytime anyone walked in front of their house, just near their property, she would run outside and yell at them until they ran away. But despite their eccentricities, it was clear to anybody that knew the Beckwith family that Linda and David just adored Daniel. They just could not give him any space. One neighbor recalled seeing the 3 Beckwiths out trick-or-treating one year, all wearing the same matching hamster outfits. And this was well into Daniel's teenage years. Daniel loved his parents, but it was in those later teenage years that he started to realize just how smothering they really were, and so he began looking for other places to connect with new people. And he found a new community on an online forum called 4chan. There, Daniel got to reinvent himself. He adopted this kind of tough guy, genius persona, where he bragged about finishing most of high school by the time he was 15, and that nowadays he just blows stuff up in his backyard to test his chemistry know-how. But over the years of posting on this channel, Daniel would occasionally let his guard down, and he would talk about something that was really close to him, that pervaded his thoughts at all times, and would ultimately be his downfall, and that was his extreme fear of death. Daniel's isolation looked like it might come to an end in 2010 when he enrolled at the University of Illinois to study computer science and electrical engineering. His parents dropped him off at the Amtrak train station with all of his stuff for college. They said their goodbyes. Daniel hopped on the train and he waved to them as they disappeared, and he likened that experience to being set free. It was the first time he was going to be without his parents for any amount of time. But unfortunately, after only being at school for a couple of months, he had to go right back home again because his mother was diagnosed with cancer. And she had hid it from Daniel. In fact, she had hid it from everyone and not even seen a doctor. And so when Daniel got home, she was in really bad shape and she passed away 2 weeks later. Including Daniel, only 3 people showed up for her funeral. And so Daniel, with his mismatched clothes and his pants that were too short, he gave his mother's eulogy, and in it, he just looked dazed and he actually said, "I feel lost." And then shortly after Daniel went back to school, his father began declining rapidly from Parkinson's disease, and so Daniel had to put him into assisted living. And so living by himself at his apartment in college, Daniel was overcome with grief, and now more than ever, he was just terrified of death because now he had seen it up close with his mother and he was watching his father wither away. And so he went back on 4chan and he began talking about taking a more defensive position against his own death. What that translated to is Daniel began researching what the most common killers were for people his age. And he discovered that car accidents were a big killer. And so he reinforced all the doors of his car with Kevlar plates, and anytime he drove it, he wore a Kevlar vest, which he believed protected him from blunt force trauma in the event of a crash. Knowing that cancer was a big killer, he went out and removed every mole on his body as a preventative measure. But what Daniel viewed as the biggest threat to his life was not something that statisticians would tell you is something people his age or people in his country should be worried about, and that was a nuclear attack on the United States. Daniel believed it was imminent. Daniel believed the only way he could protect himself was to build a proper fallout shelter. And because his mother had left him a multi-million-dollar trust fund, he had the means to construct one. And so he left college and went back to his home. He went down into the basement and he picked a spot right in the middle of the ground and he began digging. Over the next 2 years, Daniel spent part of his time living at college, being a really good student, and the other half of his time was spent living at his family home, hiring different contractors to come in and dig out this massive labyrinth of tunnels underneath his property. But in 2012, his schoolwork and his tunnel work had to come to a complete stop because he got in trouble with the law. Professors at Daniel's school began reporting that somebody was sneaking into their office, hacking into their computer, and then sending these really inappropriate and embarrassing emails to everybody in their contact list, which was primarily former and current students and faculty. And then whoever it was that was hacking their computer was then supergluing their door shut. After several months of investigating, the police finally got a suspect when students on campus said, yeah, Daniel Beckwith is actually a prolific hacker. And he just spoke at a hacker conference, so he seems like someone who would be capable of doing this. And so a detective went to Daniel's apartment to pay him a casual visit, but Daniel wasn't there or didn't come to the door, and the detective looked down and saw a package that was sitting there that was addressed to S. Loomis Detweiler. The detective believed this could be an alias for Daniel Beckwith, and so he went back and they ran that name, and sure enough, it was connected to an online persona that had recently been bragging about breaking into their professors' offices and hacking into their emails. So the police used this information to attain a search warrant. They went back to Daniel's apartment. He wasn't there. They used the key they had been given for the unit. They went inside and they're hit with just this ridiculous mess of an apartment. It looked exactly like Daniel's home growing up, with stacks of papers and books and wires and computer equipment and trash and old food containers. And there was just this dirty mattress sitting right in the middle of the apartment with no sheets on it. And in the back, on top of a mini fridge, was Daniel's laptop. It was open and it was unsecured, so they logged into it, cloned his hard drive, and left. And using the information that was contained on this hard drive, detectives were able to, without a doubt, connect Daniel to the vandalism and hacking that had been taking place at his college. Daniel was arrested and charged with a number of serious felonies, but shortly before his trial, Daniel struck a plea deal and then immediately took to Reddit to tell the world that he fully expected the state governor to pardon him because he had made a number of significant contributions to his campaign. But that pardon never came. However, Daniel's sentence was remarkably light. He was ordered to pay $23,000 in restitution to the college and then was given 2 years of probation. Daniel was expelled from his school, and so he moved back into his childhood home where he lived alone full-time. Once home, Daniel focused his efforts on this bunker he was building in his basement, which by now was a fairly large series of tunnels that zigged and zagged in different directions well beyond his property lines. Once Daniel hired a couple good contractors to continue to expand this bunker, he turned his attention to a new activity, Bitcoin trading. And in relative short order, Daniel became extremely good at this and made millions of dollars. By 2015, Daniel was off probation. His bunker was almost completely built out, although he did have plans at some point to hire more people and continue to expand it. And in terms of Bitcoin day trading, he wasn't doing it as much because he had made so much money. Now he just spent his time sitting inside of his bunker, live streaming on this new website called Blab about his investment prowess. And every time Daniel live streamed, he was cautious to never reveal his identity. And so he used the username 3Alarm Lamp Scooter, and he wore a large fire protection hood over his face, and he used a voice changer. Within his small but avid following on Blab, there was one 19-year-old named Askia Kafra who completely idolized Daniel, even though he only knew him as 3Alarm. Askia was from a middle-class home, and he was the son of immigrants from Trinidad. He also lived only 15 minutes away from Daniel, but he didn't know that because Daniel never gave up where he lived because he was so obsessed with protecting himself against a potential nuclear attack. He just told people he lived in some underground bunker in the middle of Virginia somewhere. Askia longed to be successful and rich, which is part of the reason he idolized Daniel so much. When he was 18 years old, he received a $100,000 settlement for a lead poisoning case. And he, for a second, got to live the life of someone rich and famous, and he blew it immediately on expensive dinners and rented Mercedes and BMW cars. And once the money was all gone, he was certain he could get it all back. And his big plan is he was going to build an app called Equity Shark, which is basically crowdfunding that allowed people to invest small amounts of money into new promising startups. And he believed this app was going to be the way he made not millions, but billions of dollars. But he didn't have any real money to fund this app. And so he and his business partner applied for a $100,000 grant for young entrepreneurs that have dropped out of college, something Askia had just done, and they were certain they were going to get this grant. But despite Askia's confidence, he was far from a sure bet for this money, because Askia still had many of the blind spots of someone still learning how to become an adult. And one of his biggest blind spots was how quick he was to trust people. And so it was shortly after Askia and his business partner had applied for this $100,000 grant that Askia came across Daniel on Blab, and he was so taken with him, and he's got all this money, and he's so successful. And that's when Daniel told his followers that he was open to new investments. And so Askia, who wanted to get closer to Daniel and figured he could use some additional money because even when they got this $100,000 grant, they would need more money to build the business, he decided he would ask Daniel if he and his business partner could pitch him on Equity Shark. And Daniel agreed. And so in June of 2016, Askia and his business partner went to this hookah bar that was about 20 minutes away from Askia's home, and there they sat, waiting for 3-alarm lamp scooter to walk through the door. And they didn't know what he was going to look like, because whenever they saw him on his live streams, he had that big fire protection hood on. But as soon as Daniel walked through the door, they immediately knew it was him, because he had this comically bulky shirt on where it was obvious he had a bulletproof vest on. And so this guy with the bulletproof vest walks over, introduces himself as 3-Alarm, aka Daniel. And so by now, Askia and his business partner are very accustomed to 3-Alarm's eccentricities like his bulletproof vest. They just kind of overlook it and begin pitching him on Equity Shark. And they tell him that the success of the company, they believe, is hinged on this $100,000 grant that they explained they are certain to get. They meet all the parameters. They are exactly what they're looking for. And at the end of the conversation, Daniel was convinced that not only were they going to get this $100,000 grant, but that Equity Shark seemed like a great investment. And so after a number of follow-on meetings, Daniel ultimately committed $5,000 to Equity Shark, and he told Askia that they would have to pay him back with the funds from the $100,000 grant, or if for some reason that didn't come through, Askia and his business partner would have to find another way to pay back Daniel. Askia and his business partner were totally thrilled. They felt like that $100,000 grant is a done deal, so there's no risk to this investment by Daniel. And shortly after they secured the $5,000, the manager of the $100,000 grant program called Askia and said, "Hey, you guys have made it to the second round of applicants. We need you to fly out to San Francisco and pitch your company to us." And so they're totally excited. They tell Daniel that everything's progressing exactly as they planned, and they fly out to the West Coast, but they book their flight to LAX, not to the airport in San Francisco. So they land 400 miles south of where they needed to be. And so they're cussing themselves for being so stupid about this, and they realize they can't even rent a car. They're not old enough to rent a car. But they were old enough to rent a U-Haul. So they rent this huge U-Haul and they start bombing up the coast towards San Francisco to make this meeting in time, but they plugged the wrong address into their GPS and did not go to the right building. They went in the opposite direction. And so by the time they finally got all the way back to the meeting place in San Francisco, it was too late, and the manager that was waiting for them was clearly upset about it and said, "Just go home, we'll be in touch by phone." Back home, Askia was totally embarrassed when he told Daniel about their botched trip, and he was convinced that they were not going to get the grant now because of how badly they had screwed up the meeting. And so Askia began asking Daniel if he would give them more money, because maybe if they use that additional money to bolster the app and make it more appealing, they will have a better chance at getting that $100,000 grant. Daniel eventually said he would commit more money, but Askia picked up that he was really hesitant and just seemed not to be very interested in Equity Shark anymore. And so Askia, hoping to stay in Daniel's good graces and wanting to make sure he was confident in this investment, he said, "Hey, let me do something for you. I heard on one of the channels online that you're looking to expand some of the tunnels inside of your bunker. Let me do that for you." Daniel, who was looking to expand his bunker, was eager to hire Askia. But he told him that if you're going to work for me, there's going to be heavy restrictions on how this goes, because it's a very secret location. I don't want this to leak out, where my bunker is, because as you know, there's going to be a nuclear attack on the United States any day, and my bunker is one of the only places that's going to be safe. Askia said that was totally fine. He would do whatever Daniel needed. So on January 28th, 2017, just after 2 a.m., Askia sat outside his house waiting for some car to come pick him up. And at some point, Daniel showed up in a minivan, and he walked up to Askia, he led him into the van, and then he put goggles that were blacked out on his head. And then Daniel drove around in loops up on the highway in background neighborhoods, giving the impression to Askia that they were actually going somewhere far outside of Maryland, but really they were only going 15 minutes away to Daniel's actual house. And when they got to Daniel's house, Daniel made Askia keep the goggles on. Daniel got out and he led Askia by a string into the house. And once they got inside, Daniel had to carefully walk him around all the junk that was piled up all over the house. They made their way all the way to the back. They went down the stairs into the basement, where Daniel had intentionally created this unbelievable maze all over the basement floor with chicken wire and stacks of bikes and books and more junk. It was designed so anybody who was working inside of the tunnels, that even once they came out of the exit, wouldn't even know how to get out of the basement. And finally, after bringing Askia all the way through this maze, he stopped him right in front of this hole in the ground that was the entrance into the underground tunnels. And at that point, he told Askia to remove his goggles. Daniel told him to hop down and take a look. So Askia hopped down and he's looking around and he's seeing these massive tunnel systems pushing out in all directions, and all of it is extremely well lit. And he couldn't believe what he was looking at. He's looking at Daniel like, how far does this go? And Daniel said, "It's huge." It was at this point that Daniel handed down to Askia a pickaxe, a shovel, and a hard hat, and he explained to him that anytime you're in the tunnels, I'm going to have to cover over this hole, because I can't even have you in the basement. It's too much of a security threat for me. And in fact, I'd prefer it if you worked multiple days in a row, because anytime you leave, we're going to have to do the whole blindfold thing. And so you should anticipate living in the tunnels for days at a stretch. But don't worry, there's a mattress down there, there's Wi-Fi, everything's well lit up, and there's a 5-gallon bucket if you need to go to the bathroom. And so Askia, who trusted Daniel, didn't love this setup, but in a weird way, he was just kind of excited to be a part of this guy's life, this guy who he believed was just this really amazing person. And so over the following winter and spring, Askia would make the blindfold commute all the way to Daniel's house 15 minutes away, and then he would spend multiple days down in the tunnel chiseling away into these different tunnels that Daniel wanted expanded. But as well as it was going working for Daniel, Askia was dealt some bad news at the end of the spring when it turned out Equity Shark was turned down for that $100,000 grant. Askia was surprised, he was crushed, and he now knew he would have to pay back that $5,000 that Daniel had invested in Equity Shark because he wasn't getting it from the $100,000 anymore. And so he asked Daniel if he could increase his hours in the tunnel to try to pay back that debt. Daniel agreed, and so on September 10th, Askia was back at Daniel's house, and he was down inside the tunnels in one of the lowest sections that required squeezing through a very narrow section that Askia had actually texted his friends about and said that section made him really claustrophobic, but he had to do it. He needed to pay back the debt. And so later that day at 4 p.m., when Askia was down in that lower section, the power in the tunnel suddenly went completely out. So it's pitch black. And so Daniel, who was upstairs, recognized it happened. And so he navigated through all the junk upstairs, came downstairs, navigated the maze all the way to the circuit breaker in the basement, and he flipped the switch. And the power went on, but Daniel heard a loud buzzing sound coming from upstairs in the kitchen. And so worried that could be an electrical fire, he turned back off the circuit breaker, putting Askia back in total darkness down deep inside of this tunnel. And Daniel went back through this really epic maze in the basement, went up the stairs into the kitchen to investigate the buzzing sound. And as soon as he left the basement, he could smell smoke. And he turned around and looked down into the basement, and he could clearly see smoke was filling the basement. And so Daniel ran downstairs and he yelled out for Askia, and somewhere way down in the tunnels, he heard Askia yell out, "Hey dude, what's going on?" And Daniel's like, "Come on, you gotta get out of there." But he was totally overcome with smoke, and Daniel had to run back upstairs, ran outside, he caught his breath, and then he charged back into the house, down into the basement. But as soon as he got to the bottom of the stairs, he didn't see Askia, but he saw flames leaping out of the entrance into the tunnels. And he knew Askia was down there, and he's screaming for Askia to get out, get out. But he didn't hear from him. And at some point, Daniel just had to turn around and leave because he was totally overcome with the heat and the smoke. A neighbor saw Daniel come running out. They saw the smoke coming out of his house, and so they called 911. And so while Daniel paced outside screaming for Askia, Askia is down in total darkness. There's smoke filling up the tunnels, and he began making his way across that very tight section. But once he got out of there, he had no idea where to go because this tunnel system was huge and all the power was out, so it's pitch black, and there's smoke inside of the tunnel. And so he desperately starts crawling all over the tunnel. He's hitting dead ends. And finally, miraculously, he makes it to the exit of the tunnels. Everything around him is on fire. He leaps out, but now he's in a basement that's covered in smoke. And every time he had been led to that point in the basement, he had been blindfolded. He didn't know how to navigate the maze. And so he's looking out and it's all smoky. And all he can see is there's one window on the far side that he might be able to get to. And so he starts leaping over the chicken wire and the bikes, and he sneaks past a furnace. And it's just flames and smoke all around him. And he gets to this little shimmer of light, which is the window, except he realizes there have been metal bars placed in front of it. There's no way to get through it. But in his desperation, he grabbed a rolly chair and he put it in front. He climbed on top and he managed to break the glass, but then he couldn't get through the bars. And eventually, after a number of agonizing minutes, he fell backwards and was consumed by the flames. After the fire was finally put out and Askia's body was finally found inside of the basement underneath that window, investigators didn't understand how Askia couldn't have gotten out of the basement. And Daniel tried to lie about it and say, oh, well, he might have been asleep. You know, that's his bachelor pad down there. But eventually, as investigators were looking for the cause of the fire, they uncovered the entrance to this massive tunnel system. And that's when they realized Daniel had put Askia effectively into a death trap. When the fire started, Askia was at the bottom of this tunnel system, and so he had to navigate all the way back up to the top, killing all this precious time as the fire grows, and then he finally got into the basement, and there's flames everywhere, but he has no idea how to navigate the maze Daniel had made down there. And so he managed to get to the window because it was the only thing he could see, but of course Daniel had put bars in front of it, and so Askia had nowhere else to go, and he just died. The investigators would point out that where he died, he was only 2 steps away from almost certain safety. He just didn't know it. After an 8-month investigation, prosecutors charged Daniel with involuntary manslaughter as well as one of the rarest charges in the American justice system. It's called second-degree depraved heart murder, where Daniel's disregard for human life was so extreme it amounted to willful killing. And so he was sentenced to 9 years in prison.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please replace the Amazon Music follow button's mouthwash with glass cleaner. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that honors and supports victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. If you want to check out our merch, join our Discord server, or just see what's going on at Ballen Studios, head on over to our brand new website, Ballen Studios.